Before angiosperms evolved, plants had developed a means of producing seed in another way other than flowering, and there are still many of these plants around today, and they're referred to as gymnosperms. And in other words, they are called the cone-bearing plants. And examples like outlined in your notes of gymnosperms today would be pines and various other types of conifers, cypress trees, cedars, etc. And to just take a little closer look at how these gymnosperms reproduce, we're going to use pines as an example. So we're going to talk about the pine life cycle. Again, these plants do not flower, and what they use instead of flowers are cones, and they will have both male and female cones. The male cones look like this. They tend to be small. They're located at the tips of the branches of a pine, and they're yellow in color because they're producing massive amounts of pollen, and the pines happen to produce yellow pollen. And this is indeed the pollen that you'll find covering your cars for months on end in the spring, or seemingly months on end anyway. Usually it's a couple of weeks when it's heaviest, but it's just pine pollen. So when these cones are mature, they undergo meiosis and produce pollen grains, and the pollen is released from these cones and they're carried by the wind. Now, male cones are usually found on lower branches. And each cone produces pollen grains that have two sperm cells in them, and they'll often also have two air sacs. And this picture depicts just that. We can see this is the pollen grain, and this is an air sac in this area. These two pollen grains have already started germinating. But these air sacs accomplish for them the addition of surface area without much weight. They're hollow, they're full of air. And so this allows them to have more wind resistance and allows the wind to carry them further away from the tree. It's a little bit like having a parachute attached to them, or let's say a balloon. So upon reaching a female cone, the pollen grain will germinate, as these two already have done, and it produces a pollen tube. Okay, sound familiar? Very similar to the pollen grains in angiosperms. And this tube is going to grow into the direction of the ovules, or the egg cells, that are found in a female cone. Female cones are much larger, typically. And instead of producing massive amounts of sperm cells in the form of pollen grains, they develop at the base of each scale a single ovule. And a female cone looks like this. These are the cones that we most often think of when we think of a pine cone, because these are much larger and these are the ones that we happen to see more often. They're also on the tree for a longer period of time than are the male cones, and they also lay around on the ground for quite a while as well. If you look closely, you can see right here is an actual seed that's getting ready to fall out of this cone. If we look at a microscopic view of a cross-section of one of these female cones, it looks like this. And what we're actually looking at here is this is a scale of the cone, and this is another scale here, and yet a third scale right here. And then at the base of the scale, right in here, is, in this case, this one's already been fertilized. This is an embryo, and it's developing a wing, as is common with pines, and that's what you see sticking out here. So these pollen grains land on a female cone, they germinate, they grow a pollen tube down into where the ovule is, and deposit sperm cells in this vicinity, one of which fertilizes the egg cell. Once it's fertilized, the egg cell becomes an embryo, which continues dividing and becomes this winged seed that you see in this cross section. Now, these female cones, we said the male cones are usually on the lower branches. The female cones are usually on the upper branches. And this is just a mechanism that helps prevent self-pollination by keeping these above where the male sperm cells would be released, or the pollen grains would be released, because remembering that the wind is what's going to carry that pollen around. And although they may go upward on wind currents, typically wind currents are not blowing straight up from the ground, and so there's very little chance that any of those pollen grains from the same tree would reach a female cone in those upper branches.